So by now, people have begun to construct lists for the best films of 2020. I don't usually mind those kinds of lists, but 2020 is, I think, a very odd year, so it's unclear how we're going to really categorize it. And I always like to do things a little bit differently, so we're going to actually here look at films of some of the last decades, and then we'll get up to the last year slowly. So what is the film of the last decade? Well, this is a really tough competition, of course, because there were quite a few offerings. And I myself personally find Birdman probably the most powerful. Again, personally. But if I had to be honest, I think the best in terms of quality is Mad Max Fury Road, which is this really interesting, if bizarre, post-apocalyptic myth. If you're a long-term action fan, you know who Mad Max is. But even if you're not, this is a really interesting rebooted version of the character and the way he struggles within this new kind of desert environment and has to hook up with these various female allies in order to survive essentially a fascist dictator called Joe, who has created this kind of death cult with his so-called war boys, and how essentially he's caught up in this maelstrom because when he enters it, he's essentially captured and then slowly tries to regain his freedom. And afterwards, he has to sort of come to this negotiating position with the various female protagonists and sort of find a way to survive what Joe is up to. But I think, of course, the really interesting thing here is the way that protagonist roles sort of are changed all over the place. And a lot of people have complained that Mad Max turns into a supporting character. I don't think that's a major issue because sometimes he is the supporting character in the other entries. But clearly this is more of a Charlize Theron film than a Tom Hardy film. That's definitely true. The focus is on Furiosa and how she is trying to avoid Joe or confront him in order to save his wives who he's captured, and she liberates at a huge cost to herself. Now, I think people have already thought through that this film is very political in a certain way, and it is, but I don't think it's kind of dogmatic. It is true that Miller has stated there is an agenda to the film, but it's not beating you over the head. It's definitely anti-fascist, and my only one complaint here is he is dealing pretty well with a kind of generic form of fascism. Fascism is often a death cult for various followers, but not all fascist movements, glorify death or idolize it. Some, do focus on birth and renewal. It's also not as anti-intellectual as he makes it seem. I mean, Hitler, for instance, was a notorious bibliophile. In fact, you can go to Washington, D.C. and get access to his library. So there are some inaccuracies here and there, but I think as a generic form of fascism, Joe is pretty compelling. And although the myth structure he gives is pretty simple, I have to say it's still really well done. It doesn't have the resonance of something like Star Wars, that's true, but I think overall he presented a very interesting, complex story without going overboard. I'm not going to spoil the plot, which I think is, it's fairly well done. I mean, again, as an action director, he knows what to do in terms of special effects. I think people have exaggerated there are no special effects. This is very special effects oriented, but the special effects never drown out the characters. The characters are the main focus of the plot and narrative. So I thought that was a refreshing thing, especially from many action films of the last decade. But I think, again, what makes this stand out is his very auteur touches, not just in terms of the action or characters, but in terms of just these kind of sly jokes he keeps playing. A lot of people think that this has no comedy. I would disagree highly. He does a really fantastic job of sort of revisioning how we would look after the apocalypse and how, everyday objects are sort of redefined and recontextualized. So there's a lot of humor here, but it's not obvious. It's not the MCU. And also the ecological issues he raises aren't done in a kind of like simple moralistic fashion. We sort of see the good and bad of both sides of the obvious evils of the patriarchy with Joe, but also the evils of the matriarchy when they're presented as well. So I think the basic message is that Mad Max and Furiosa have to kind of find a third way where they cooperate with one another for a new future. But even the ending is pretty well done. It doesn't go where you think it would. It's not a simple yes or no question in terms of, well, how do you work against, quote, a fascist apocalypse and rebuild afterwards? So I think it's pretty well done, not just in terms of level of the narrative, but in terms of the larger themes it's trying to articulate. It never goes too much in one direction or the other. It's never too focused too much on, quote, deep philosophical issues. There's always a lot of action going on. This is extremely action-filled, but the action is never gratuitous or exploited. The only minor complaints I would have is the cinematography. While it looks really beautiful, it seems kind of plain. If you do have the extra money, I would recommend looking at the black and white version. I myself have not seen that, so I cannot personally recommend it, but Mark Kermode, he's a very great British film critic, he's highly recommended it, and he is not easy to please on these issues. This has been Partially Examined Kubrick on the film of the last decade, Mad Max Fury Road by George Miller. All right, if you like the content, please hit the like button and or subscribe. Please comment below if you can. It helps the channel. Thank you for listening.